Hey, Julie, thanks for coming on the podcast today. I'm excited to talk to you about your new book, Waiting for the Night Song. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, sure. Well, to start off, would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a mother of four. I live in New England with my husband and the kids and two dogs. I grew up in Maryland, but I've been a New Englander for long enough that fully count myself as a New Englander at this point. I'm a
Okay.
journalist, and I also own and operate a small organic farm in addition to writing.
Wow, sound busy.
It's fun.
Cool. Yeah, the organic farm, I'm sure, is a lot of fun. So I wanted to talk obviously about your book, Waiting for the Night Song. I was kind of, when I was preparing for this interview, trying to figure out where to start because there are so many like relevant themes in the book that um, are just very timely for today. We talk about like racism. There's obviously a lot of talk about climate change. There's a lot of talk about environmental racism too, which I really think is great. So I just wanted to hear like what inspired you to write the book originally.
Yeah, it didn't start out with all these big ideas in the story.
Mhm.
This image of little girls in a boat picking blueberries. That was
Yeah.
the center of the story. And it's because I have kids, and I would take my kids blueberry picking by on a boat in a lake in New
Mhm.
Hampshire. And we would take blueberries from land. There's just these wide open stretches of land. And my kids started asking me if we were stealing them because they weren't ours. And I mean, truthfully, they weren't ours, but there was just big open land. So I
Mhm.
started making up these rules for when it was okay to take the blueberries, which
Okay.
then became this code, which appears in the book. The kids in my book are
Mhm.
stealing blueberries, and they make up a list of rules that they think justify when it's okay to take the blueberries. So this central idea that
Mhm.
actually came out of a moment of bad parenting, of trying to justify these things to my children. It became this what if moment. Like, what if these kids took these rules and internalized them and turned it into something real, something that
Mhm.
they really truly believed in, and how far would they go? In the story, they end up using it to partially shield themselves from
Yeah.
taking responsibility for a bad decision. But so the central image, it all grew up from there. And I realized I needed Katie, my main character, to come home
Mhm.
as an adult. And what was going to be different about home when she hadn't been home for several decades? And so climate emerged first in the
Mhm.
story because there's some information in the story that is real. Like, the temperature in New Hampshire has gone up
Yeah.
disproportionate to other parts of the country. But if you look at New Hampshire, we don't look like a climate disaster zone. You don't see,
Mhm.
people running around screaming about climate change in New Hampshire, even though our temperature's gone up. Summer temperatures 4 degrees over a century.
Oh, wow.
So that's a really, I mean, if you look at just that number, it's huge. So what
Mhm.
I did is I had the story is a dual timeline story. It goes back and
Yeah.
forth between Katie's viewpoint at age 11 and when she's an adult. So I wanted to really dig into what would be different, not just in the environment, but in the
Mhm.
people and the
Yeah.
community and the way they connect with each other. So I started researching all the things about this small, slow burning change in the climate in New Hampshire and
Mhm.
how it would affect different people in the community. And it affects everybody differently. And
Yeah.
I also realized you can't really talk about climate in a silo. You can't talk about the
Totally.
climate crisis just in New Hampshire, because it's not. It's all connected. So these threads that you talk about, they
Yeah.
all grew out of this idea of what are the impacts on a tiny town in the mountains of New Hampshire that we wouldn't expect. And then I drew the lines out broader. I drew the lines down to the Caribbean, where there's deforestation, to Central America,
Yeah.
resulting from US intervention in the 80s. So all those things came out of this image of what would be different when someone
Mhm.
came home decades later.
I think that's great. Yeah, I think there aren't really a ton of stories about, like, as you said, like small mountain towns. I feel like places like that, they're like, oh, I'm not near the coast, like I'm pretty insulated from the effects of climate change. Um, but like as you say, everything is kind of interconnected, and especially when you're talking about something as colossal as climate change, tiny, it's kind of like the butterfly effect, I guess. Like tiny
Yeah.
little changes, thousands of miles away even can still impact you from there. So yeah, I think it's great that your book does that.
And I think it's also, here, I mean, especially in the US, but not just in
Hmm.
the US, we have this kind of myopic view of climate change as
Yeah.
something that's coming, it's looming, we're
Totally.
preparing, but it's kind of a privileged perspective, because
Hmm.
there's a lot of places in the world that are already feeling it very deeply. There's the
Yeah.
climate refugee situation all around the world. To never, we've never experienced this. So sitting in a town in New Hampshire, it would be really easy to just say, it's not here yet, it's
Yeah.
not us.
not
but
my
it is us. It's all of us. And so that's why I tried to draw the lines outside of this town in very real ways. These are not facts that I made up, and the story
Right.
is fiction, but
Hmm.
the lines I drew are very real.
Cool. I love that. Yeah. Well, speaking of the facts, you talk about, well, I guess Katie herself is an entomologist in the book, which I thought was a really cool way to approach this story or talk about climate, because I feel like nobody really thinks about bugs when they think about climate change, or insects specifically. But like, yeah, in the book, Katie is tracking the spread of these pine beetles that I think actually come from my neck of the woods, down here in the South. When I was growing up, I don't know if I was actually wanting to look it up since I started reading your book, but I remember when I was growing up, like we had a ton of problems with like pine beetles because we have a lot of yellow pines here in Georgia and in Florida too. So, um, like you'd see dead pine trees all the time when you were a kid. And I was, when I was reading your book, your descriptions of what the trees look like after they've had a beetle infestation was just like spot on. Like I was like, yeah, that is what it looks like, because you would see dead trees with like the bark falling off and it would have these kind of like almost like spider webby patterns on them. And it was kind of pretty, but it's also really, really bad that it was happening. So yeah, I guess I was just wondering if this was like an issue you were wanting to draw attention to, specifically the beetles, or I don't know if it was just like a way to talk about climate change.
Well, that wasn't initially. She wasn't an entomologist in the first
Okay.
versions of the story. She was a journalist, and it's because
Yeah.
I'm a journalist. So that was really easy for me to write, and I had her writing a story about this beetle and tracking, following a person doing the research.
Hmm.
And I had a really astute writing instructor tell me, you've taken Katie too far away from the things she loves. As a little girl, Katie is very in tune with nature. She's climbing
Yes.
trees, jumping off rocks in the water. She tastes nature. She
Hmm.
very much feels a part of the environment. And as an adult, I had her in an office writing on a computer. And that didn't, and my instructor was like, that is not who Katie would grow up to be. And I was like, that's a great observation. So I put her in the woods,
Yeah.
deep in the woods alone, because that's, I think, who Katie would have grown up to be, that little girl. That's what she would have done. But as
Yeah.
far as the specific beetle, it's a real beetle. The mountain pine bark beetle
Yep.
is, there are a lot of different beetles that are attacking, different regions of the country. And this
Okay.
particular beetle is the one that's primarily responsible for a lot of the forest fires in California and Colorado. It goes in
Yeah.
and during a drought, it moves in. It's very opportunistic, and it
Mhm.
takes weakened pine trees and it cuts off the resin flow. So it basically starves the tree
Yeah.
when it's already weak. And then a fire comes and it's just all
Mhm.
dry wood in the forest. So we've seen a lot of that, and they are moving east. It's in Canada. It is in parts of the southern part of the United States now. So I don't know for a fact that it's in your region, but maybe it is.
Yeah.
But it is not in New England. I took some fictional license and moved the beetle to New England, and the reason I chose to do that is I wanted there to be disbelief that the
Okay.
beetle was there. And I couldn't have disbelief if I put it in a region where we already knew the
Gotcha.
beetle existed.
Okay.
But I did a lot of reading about the beetle. And there's some interesting conflicting ideas about it, which I explore in there about
Mhm.
different things. How do you attack? I mean, how do you get ahead of these beetles?
Mhm.
And different scientists have different viewpoints on what the best way to handle it is. But this beetle, to me, it's so tiny, and it is so devastating to such a huge forest, but also it's kind of beautiful. The
Yeah.
way that I talk about in the book that the beetles burrow into the tree, and
Mhm.
they burrow these little, it almost looks like carvings, like handwriting in a foreign language or something, that the what they leave behind is actually stunning. And there's
Mhm.
artwork that's been made out of this wood,
Oh,
just to
wow.
highlight that. In fact, in my house, the floorboards in my bedroom are not from this beetle, but it is a spalted wood from a
Mhm.
maple tree that's been attacked by a different invader. And
Yeah.
I love that there is a beauty in
Mhm.
this destruction,
Yeah.
and that they're not the villain. They're just opportunistically trying to find a place to survive, a place
Yep.
to raise a family and find something to eat,
Yeah.
and just like we're all doing. And
Mhm.
it just happens to be really destructive in the
Yeah.
process.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. That makes sense. Um, yeah, and I feel like I have seen some of that artwork maybe with the like where you can see where the Beatles were, but I have seen houses where the floorboards had that in too, and it's super cool looking. And I feel like it adds a lot of character to the house. And yeah. Yeah, so I wanted to circle back a little bit. I think you were talking about a little bit when we were starting out, but the poacher's code.
Yeah.
Yeah, when Katie and Daniela are first poaching their blueberries from their little rowboat. It struck me when I was reading that. I was like, this is kind of like, I mean, there are obviously some elements of it that are just kind of make believe fun sort of things. But also I was like, this is kind of like I guess like a sustainability kind of code or a pact in some ways. Did you have that in mind when you were writing that, or yeah? I don't know.
Yeah, so that code, as I mentioned, was really the launching point for the story.
Mhm.
So Katie, as a little girl, she, just for, people who haven't read the book, is
Yeah.
she is this, kind of a little 11-year-old girl who just believes in magic everywhere. And I don't mean that
Yeah.
she actually thinks there's magic going on, but she sees wonder and awe in
Mhm.
everything. She's always imagining an adventure, and she really truly loves nature in a way that's just like it's a part of who she is. She lives deep in the woods with her family, and she's
Yeah.
always just running wild. And I grew up that way to a degree. I was in a suburban area. I mean, I
Mhm.
was not deep in the woods of New Hampshire, but I was a kid who could leave the house in the morning and not come home till dinner, and nobody would come looking for me. And my friends and I would play in the woods, and we built
Yeah.
so many forts and tree houses and
Yeah.
splashed in, so that was really real. And so Katie she loves nature, and the idea of destroying something,
Mhm.
it just feels intrinsically wrong to her. So
Yeah.
when they make this list of blueberries, a list of rules for picking the blueberries,
Mhm.
they involve things like never killing a spider.
Yeah.
And never taking all the berries from one bush. Don't pick berries if there's a bird's nest in the bush. So a
Mhm.
lot of them are these very rudimentary conservation rules of
Yeah.
protecting what's there, and not, the do no harm,
Mhm.
not causing an impact on your environment. Although they're not consciously talking about that, they are understanding the ramifications of small actions.
Yeah.
And there's a little, almost like a parable in there, that when
Mhm.
Daniela, Katie's best friend and her, conspirator and stealing blueberries,
Yeah.
wants to kill a spider, and Katie freaks out with this idea that if you kill that spider, you have no idea what the impact will be. Like, what if that spider had
Mhm.
all these babies that had all these
Yeah.
babies,
Yeah.
and it's going to bite this one person one day, and we're going to change everything. So don't kill
Mhm.
the spider. And
Yeah.
that is kind of like the message of the whole story, in a way, of the whole book, of do no harm, and think ethically and make good decisions,
Mhm.
because you have no idea who your decisions are going to impact.
Yeah, I remember that paragraph. I really love that. And I was like, I feel like she's going somewhere with this. I feel like this is going to be like a pretty big theme throughout the book. And yeah, I think I was right. But yeah, I love how you talk about how Katie has this like how you said like she sees magic everywhere, or like wonder. I like kind of grew up like that, even though I grew up in the suburbs outside of Atlanta. We had like there was a bunch of undeveloped property that they were like building out the subdivision I grew up in, so it was just like woods, and like my little neighborhood friends and me, we would, we just spent like hours in the woods, and like my parents would think we got lost and freak out and stuff. But we like would be like playing in the creek and stuff like that, and just getting really messy and playing in the woods. But yeah, I like especially when I was younger, like like when I would be reading books like The Hobbit and stuff like that, like my imagination would just kind of go wild, and I would be like, oh, like this is like a magical woodland or whatever. And
Yes,
yeah, and
yes.
you totally do like kind of have this like you do kind of like see magic everywhere. At least I did when I was a kid, and so I really related to that when I was reading about Katie's doing that. But I'm wondering, like, is that something you think we lose when we get older, or is that like something that has to be kind of nurtured? I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
I do think we lose that. And
Mhm.
just a little background is that the relationship between Katie and Daniela was based very much on a real friendship I had growing
Okay.
up, of my friend. It's not her, it's not based on things we actually did, but the
Mhm.
dynamics of the relationship
Sure.
are very real. That we used to just, we were always out there. We had made up all these stories. I mean, we made up stories about, escaped murderers hiding in the woods, and we were tracking them. We made up stories about, we used to play Charlie's Angels in the woods. Like,
Yeah.
I was always Sabrina, by the way. But we would just act out stories. I was always writing, even as a little kid. I used to write fan fiction scripts for TV shows,
Yeah.
like
I did that
Wonder
too.
Woman and Mork and Mindy. And my friend and I would act these ridiculous scripts out. And we were just always in the woods, always doing like
Mhm.
imaginative, adventurous things. Although there wasn't any real adventure in our life, we were making it up. Like, I didn't have,
Mhm.
I did not witness a crime as the
Yeah.
characters in my book do.
Yeah.
These things weren't real, but
Probably for the
we,
best.
it is for the best, I think. but we, we always saw the possibility that at any moment a big adventure might happen. Like tomorrow, a murderer might come into the woods and we might catch him. Like we had that. I truly believed that as a child. Like I honestly believed that. My friend and I once tried to build a flying machine, which was completely not aerodynamic at all. But we were pretty sure that at any point this thing was going to fly.
So funny.
So I think that we do lose that. And we get further away from nature in a lot of respects as an adult, but we also don't see it the same way. We don't look at a big swath of woods and think there's some mad fairies hiding in it, or we don't see that. We just see the beetles destroying the trees. So I really wanted Katie actually as an adult to kind of reconnect to that, and I think in the story she does a bit. She is just literally tasting the lake water she would ingest as a child. She's trying to find her way back to that sense of wonder.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, it's funny. Like I lived in Nashville for a long time, I think like 7 years, and then when the pandemic hit, I moved back here to the Atlanta area. So now like on the weekend or something, when I'm out with my wife, we'll go hiking and stuff to a lot of the old places I went when I was a kid. I'll be like, oh, I remember seeing that cave entrance or whatever and thinking trolls lived in there or something like that. So yeah, that's funny.
That's good stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of fun to go back and do that. So one of the things, shifting gears a little bit, one of the things I wanted to also talk about was Katie as an adult working as a scientist. I hope I'm not giving away too many spoilers by saying this, but kind of one of the central conflicts of the book is that she is doing research, I guess kind of outside of her hometown in New Hampshire. And she's actually trespassing on federal property because she's tracking the pine beetle up through there. And it's illegal for her to do that, but she's also this is too important. It's worth it for me to break the law to do this. But when she does go back to her hometown and tries to kind of raise the alarm on this beetle has spread way further than we thought. It's posing a massive fire risk. There could be wildfires here like there were in California and Colorado. Kind of the response is, I think one of the firefighters says fires are job insurance for us. And people kind of just scoff at her and don't really take her seriously. And Katie says, there's this quote that I had highlighted that I wanted to read. She said, we have to do something. I feel like I've been screaming fire in a theater and no one is running out. It's going to take a significant fire before people will believe how serious this is. So when I read that really reminded me of Greta Thunberg and the work that the youth climate movement in Europe has been doing. They frequently say our house is on fire and they feel like nobody's listening to us. So I'm curious to hear what you think. Do you think it will take a big fire, metaphorically speaking, for people to finally wake up to this? Are there some other things we could be doing?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I think that people have been screaming fire for a long time. I mean, look at Houston right now. I mean, it's obviously not fire, it's ice. But people have been right now. Everybody's in Houston is talking about their energy grid and all these things, but they were ignoring it until it crashed. So I think it takes, people don't believe it or they don't want to see it and they put on blinders and ignore a problem until it's in their, in their backyard. And I think that's pretty typical. And I think with Katie, the reason that storyline came in is while I was doing research for this book, I started following all these entomologists and all these entomology groups online, and bug Twitter is amazing. Oh my gosh, insect Twitter is just crawling with good information. But so I, just eavesdrop on all these conversations going on, and there was a conversation going on with some entomologists talking about some federal land closing off research that had been going on for a long time. And so even if say I don't know the outcome of this specific situation, but even if now the land was open up, there are years of missing data from that project,
right?
That cannot be replaced. So they might have had 10 years worth of data on the specific research project. They miss 3 or 4 of them, and then they can pick it up. But what happened in those 3 or 4 years will never be recovered.
Yeah. And
so there's a lot of that happened in a lot of a lot of different projects, and so I amped it up a bit in my book. I took again a little bit of fictional license and just made it all federal lands that she was cut off from. Basically to be jarring, to jar people. If the government, chose to cut off environmental research on federal land, what would that mean and what's the danger. So I put a
Mhm.
very specific danger in that land.
Yeah.
And so Katie, who is a very, kind of, she's a loner. She lives alone. She works alone in the woods. She's very non-confrontational
Uh-huh.
and she doesn't want to be a climate warrior. She just wants to find this bug. She's a
Yeah.
scientist. She wants to find this insect, prove she's right, head off a forest fire, and then move on to the next insect,
Yeah.
or next forest. But she becomes a hashtag in
Yeah.
because she chooses to follow the science, not the politics. And
Yeah.
she goes in and does the research anyway because she believes she knows that she's right. She
Hmm.
knows that not doing her research will result most likely in a fire that
Yeah.
could hurt people, or burn homes, or all, has a lot of ramifications. So to her, the moral imperative is clear. Like,
Mhm.
is it, truth or politics? And she
Yeah.
chooses truth. And she goes in and does this anyway. And so it's a very real thing. And I exaggerated things in the
Hmm.
book because, and also, if you'll notice, the book was never set in a specific year, which I did intentionally.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
didn't want it to be tied to a specific year, to a specific thing happening in the government, to a
Yeah.
specific year of drought or
Hmm.
fire season. Like, I wanted it to be floating, maybe just hovering in our future, but it's undefined because I wanted all of those things to be possible.
Yeah.
Um, and I hope I hope I achieved that effect, that it
Yeah.
could happen at any minute and we need to be on alert.
Hmm. Yeah. I think so. Yeah. It reminded me a lot of like when the Trump administration like directed people in the EPA to scrub like the climate change page from the website. And I was encouraged to see that a lot of scientists like kind of stood up to that. And a lot of times they were like, this is ridiculous. No, like we're not going to do that. That goes against everything we stand for. And a lot of people like resigned and stuff. It was a pretty big deal. But so
I
yeah, I
took a
think
lot of inspiration from that, actually. That was not
cool.
specifically in the story, but it was the inspiration of the scientists standing up to government that I
Mhm.
wanted to, just, channel into Katie.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of was thinking about that when I read that. So I was wondering if that was served as any kind of inspiration. Again, switching gears just a little bit, I wanted to talk about environmental racism as it's presented in your book. And Katie has this friend Daniella, whose family has immigrated from El Salvador, but they are undocumented, so they're there illegally. But we see like how I guess this is all connected to climate change throughout the book, and especially my favorite character, Sal. She kind of talks about this, and it really kind of lays it out for Katie a little bit later in the book, about halfway through. But yeah, so I wondered, like, if you would just talk a little bit more about like how your novel discusses those topics and like how it, I guess, comes through in certain characters.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack on that topic.
Yeah.
So that wasn't, when I started out the book, that wasn't like my goals
Mm,
but when I again came back to those pieces of data about the 4-degree rise in temperature in our
mhm.
area, and that our growing season is 22 days longer in New Hampshire than it was a century ago, which that's 3 weeks longer. And I know that because as a farmer, I've done research on my growing
Mhm.
area and everything. And so when I was trying to extrapolate all that data into like all the people it affect, I was like thinking really hard, who are the people who are going to be affected first? And as we know, in most cases, climate change or climate crisis events tend to affect communities of color first: Black
Yeah.
and brown communities, indigenous communities, poor communities all over the world, not
Mhm.
just here, but all over the world, that are feeling the effects first. And it's in part because they might not have access to like mitigate, climate mitigation efforts, or to move to
Yeah.
just leave that land, or to maybe that's why they were on this land in the first place, because they were relegated to the most vulnerable places on the planet.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, to tell a climate story and not address the communities that are feeling it first and worst would
Mhm.
be disingenuous, and it wouldn't be a true story. So I was looking, and I also think that, when you think of New Hampshire, you do not think of New Hampshire as a hotbed for immigration.
Yeah.
We are,
That
but
too when I was
immigration
reading
is
it.
everywhere.
Yeah.
The town in my story, I made it up. It's a fictional town, and it's
Mhm.
not meant to represent any specific town in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
I really, in my mind, think of it as like an any town, small town.
Mhm.
That I think there's a lot of New Hampshire in it, obviously, because it's
Yeah.
set there. But the dynamics of a community and the people in the community, who's an outsider, who
Mhm.
belongs, is a question that people grapple with in any town.
Yeah.
And so in this specific situation, there are migrant farm workers all over our country, including in New Hampshire. New Hampshire might not be the place you think of when I say, migrant farm workers, but there are. And so I wanted to, Daniella's family is in the story as full characters. They are not there to represent immigrants. Daniella is Katie's best friend. She's her, the person she loves most as a child, and as an adult, it's the friendship she values most. And the characters, their backstories go back to the U.S. intervention in Central America in the 80s, when we went in militarily, when our corporations went in, and agriculture. The deforestation in El Salvador is shocking. There was 97 to 98% of the forests were destroyed, which is, if you wrap your mind around that it's unconscionable that we did this. And obviously we're not responsible for every one of those trees. I'm sure lots of El Salvadoran farmers bought into this too, and also tore down the trees. But we set this thing in motion, and it caused erosion of land, of topsoil, because we took all the trees down, which meant that the land wasn't holding water, which led to drought, crop failures, agricultural crisis, hunger, poverty, and that leads to violence. And all these things that we're seeing playing out, I can't say that the United States is responsible for 100% of the problems, but so much of it is because of a thing we set in motion.
Totally.
And so the book takes these stories from back in the 80s and makes them real for one family. And then it, follows the family. And then in the present day storyline, when Katie is an adult, there are also immigration storyline in that storyline as well. And I think it's because it's a very real part of the tapestry of our life. We can't separate ourselves anymore, or we never should have. We're all part of this story together. So when I was telling the story, I didn't have a checklist. I'm going to write about environmental themes. I'm going to write about immigration. It entered the story because it did not seem there was a way I could tell this story and leave parts of the community out, because then it wouldn't be a full story of this town. And I really wanted the town to be represented from all angles. Yeah.
I'm glad you did that too, because I feel like a lot of the time, so many people don't understand why we have sort of such a huge immigration problem right now. And I say problem, but it's a crisis. People are fleeing their homes because it's not safe, and they're seeking a better life. But a lot of people don't understand why are you, if you're coming from Central America or from Mexico, maybe why are you risking so much just to cross the border? And it's because of things like climate change. It was a huge driver of it, maybe the primary driver of it. And I feel that those dots just don't get connected for a lot of people. So I think it's cool that you chose to address it that way.
Yeah. And another little tiny thread that I drew is that in the title of the book, Waiting for the Night Song, it's referring to a songbird. And it's this little tiny bird, a very real bird called a Bicknell's thrush. And it lives in New Hampshire, in New England and Canada. And it's this teeny tiny, very nondescript little gray bird that would fit in the palm of your hand. It would fly by you and you would never notice this bird. It's just inconsequential. But it's not inconsequential. And in my book, and in real life, I didn't make this up, it migrates to the Caribbean every winter. But in the Caribbean, its habitat's being destroyed partly by hurricanes and partly by deforestation in the region. And so the little bird is not coming back to New England. Every year it comes back in smaller numbers. And because it's dying over the winter because its habitat's being destroyed. And so I wanted to find all the ways that this little town in New Hampshire is connected to other parts of the world, and how climate is related, to El Salvador, to the Caribbean, and to this beetle that's come from the Rockies that came, and that there's so many moving parts in our ecosystem, and that as the world is changing and as temperatures are rising and different, climate factors are changing. When there's a hole in our ecosystem from a bird not coming back, or something changes because of something moving in, we're shifting constantly. And to pretend that we're not is really short-sighted. We might not want an invasive beetle, but we need to know it's there. And we might not want to take responsibility for actions of our country, decades ago, and in Central America. We need to own all these things and look at the big picture. And so I think I was trying to tie all those little things up in a tiny town in New Hampshire that nobody would think about any of these things.
Yeah, cool. I love that. Well, I was going to see if you wanted to read a passage from the book, actually.
Sure. Did you have something in mind, or do you want me to?
Author's pick, whatever you want.
Okay. Well, no, that's good. That's great. I'll tell you one passage. I don't usually read this, but I feel like in the context of our conversation, I think this kind of makes sense. There's a scene in about 2/3 of the way through the book where Katie meets up with Piper. If you remember, Piper is the grad student. She's a scientist studying birds, but also with an eye towards climate crisis and how it's affecting the forest. So she's studying the Bicknell's thrush. Katie studies the beetle, and and their worlds collide a little bit in that some of the impacts of climate change are driving this little bird out and bringing the beetle in. And so their territories overlap, but they don't agree. So I'm going to read just a couple paragraphs, or like a page maybe, when they first meet for the first. They've exchanged emails, but they've never met. So Piper is a young grad student, and there's been a forest fire, not in the town where she lives, but nearby, and they're meeting at the site of the forest fire after the fact to do research. Okay, so Katie's walking to the forest. Beauty she had not anticipated saturated the light in the air. The fire had rendered the woods a negative X-ray of itself, stripped down to its most elemental and raw form, like a cast of dancers frozen in position. The absence of color quieted her mind like a drug as she walked through the stark, silent landscape. Air moved without the buffer of branches and leaves overhead. No one could hide in this scorched graveyard. It wasn't a forest anymore. It wasn't a fire, a refuge, or a home. In this half place, Katie's burdens felt lighter, as if the gravity drawing them against her heart had been diminished. Chalky debris swirling in the air caught rays of sunlight. Katie blew into the cloud of particles and watched the ash dance. Vertical lines of the snag forest drew her eyes upward to the shocking blue of the sky. The sky she had left behind in Maple Crest had not seemed as blue. Katie walked toward a petite woman bent over examining a tree trunk. When she heard Katie's footsteps, she stood up. Katie recognized the shock of purple hair from outside the ethics committee meeting. "You're Piper." Cadence Kessler. The woman dropped her bag and a compact chainsaw to run towards Katie. "I'm so happy to finally meet you, like for real meet you." The smell of patchouli nearly gagged Katie as Piper pulled her into a hug. "Everyone's talking about you. Have you seen the Cadence Under Fire hashtag?" "Did you do that?" Katie asked. "I won't confirm or deny that. I'm the one who emailed you about the Bicknell's thrush. Do you remember? I read the material you sent. It was well researched." Piper beamed. She picked up the chainsaw. "The university's going to take a lot of heat because of what you did, you know." She swung the chainsaw back and forth as she talked. "The government can sue the school, and it would set in motion a series of other challenges. You could end up in the Supreme Court." "I don't think so." Katie swallowed down the stomach acid creeping up her throat. "It's not that big a deal. I just collected a few dead beetles." "You could be the reason they open the federal lands back up," Piper paused. "Or I could go to jail and never work again," Katie said. So I'll stop there. The two of them meeting sets a lot of things in motion for Katie because Piper has a different viewpoint. Katie wants to get ahead of the beetles and stop the infestation, thin the trees so there won't be more dead wood to burn. Piper says, "Let it burn." She's like, this is nature's way of rebalancing things, that the stronger trees will survive, and those trees are the ones that will repopulate the forest, and we need a more resilient forest, so let it burn. So they have these two conflicting ideas, and Katie walks into that forest in this passage set in her beliefs. Here's Piper's idea, is very resistant to it, and then through the rest of the book, Piper's ideas start getting in her head, and she starts questioning her own judgment and considering some other viewpoints, which is a conversation I think is happening for real between people who are studying this problem, is get ahead of it to protect some houses, or like let it burn. And that's a tough question.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'm trying to imagine being in that situation, trying to deal with that decision of do I just let this entire forest burn, or do we try to get ahead of it and actually cut it down?
It's a hard question, because big picture, you can make a really great case for why it makes sense to let it burn. The beetles will be burned when the forest burns. And that there have been studies, which I find really fascinating, that when a forest that's been infested by the mountain pine bark beetle, and it's killed off a lot of trees, and in a drought situation, and then it burns. They've done studies that the trees that survive the beetles and the fire are more resistant to climate change.
Huh.
And so if those trees are only the only ones that survive, they have no competition from these other like weaker trees.
Yeah.
They repopulate the forest with stronger trees. That makes so much sense. Like there's so much
Mhm.
logic there. But what about the houses? What about the people and the businesses and the danger of the fire? So there's these conflicting
Mhm.
needs, which I tried to play out. And I don't answer the question. Like I don't say in the end, give you a nice answer of here's the solution. It's still a question.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it'd be hard to like offer a concrete
And
solution.
I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to
Yeah.
pretend I have the answer.
Yeah. Not like nature is so cool. Like I
Yeah,
just yeah, it's like even when and like again, neither of us are scientists. I could be totally wrong saying this, but like even in a situation like that where it's like we've created this problem of climate change, like this is our fault, like we have to fix it. Like even when we're trying to fix it, it seems like we can still screw it up even worse.
yeah,
Even though
yeah.
we
We
can
are so
really
good at
like
that.
yeah, yeah, it's just kind of like mind blowing how I mean, I guess in every situation this doesn't happen, but in a lot of situations it seems like nature is pretty good at like course correcting and like um getting itself back to a state of like where it was before, maybe being
Yeah,
a little bit more healthy. So yeah, when I was reading about Piper, that really, I mean, especially like when I was reading earlier about Sal, I was thinking about like youth climate activists, but then when I got to Piper, it was really kind of thinking about it. So I like young people have been doing a lot to kind of raise the alarm on the lack of climate action around the world. I mentioned like European activists, but
hmm
like we've seen this all over the place. Like it's in India, it's in Africa, it's like here, especially among like indigenous communities.
yeah,
So I'm curious, like, I mean, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot to unpack. A lot of people and like activists themselves say like it's like insane that we're the ones having to do this. Like we're the ones who are kind of getting screwed over in this situation, and yet we're the ones who are kind of having to act like the adults in the room, so to speak.
yeah.
But yeah, I'm just would kind of like to hear your thoughts on like youth climate activism and like what the adult response to that should be, I guess.
Yeah, I am glad you brought Sal up because she is hands down my favorite character in the book. Like I
She's
love
such a
Sal.
cool little kid. Yeah,
Yeah, so for
I
the
love her.
for listeners who haven't read it, Sal is a 13-year-old girl. She's the daughter of Katie's best friend Daniella,
Yeah.
and she knows who she is. When I was writing Sal, a lot of it is I want to write the kid I wish I was when I was
Yeah.
13. I want to write the kid who so fearlessly believes in the things she believes in that she
Mhm.
doesn't care if like she gets in trouble. There's a scene where she gets expelled from or suspended from school for standing up for another kid. Now she
Mhm.
chooses to do it in a way that maybe wasn't the best way to do it. She
Yeah.
jumps up on a teacher's desk and starts yelling and ends up breaking something. But her motives were really good. But
Yeah.
she's passionate and
Mhm.
she lives her passions without a filter.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we see a lot with the youth activism is they don't
Mhm.
have this. We have as adults have this filter of like how far we can go or not wanting
Yeah.
to upset people or mess up the system or even if
Mhm.
we believe something, we never act on it to the fullest. I shouldn't say never. There's a lot of people who do. So I don't want to lump everybody,
Yeah.
but these youth
It gets
activists,
harder though. Yeah.
it's harder, but also the youth activists are closer to that sense of wonder when they're
Yeah.
children than we are. We are so removed and we have like, taxes and like budgets and rent payment, and
Yeah.
mortgages and stuff like that. The
Mhm.
kids like Sal, she's an immigration activist. She is a
Yeah.
climate activist and she lives it 100%.
Yeah.
She doesn't care about like in Katie's case, she's worried like, oh my God, what if I get arrested?
Yeah.
She's like, suspend me. I don't care. I'm not going to sit here and take this, so
Yeah.
she's the kid I wish I would have been, when I
Mhm.
was 13 and I would have been
Me too.
afraid. Yeah. I would have
Yeah.
been afraid of like ridicule or afraid to stand up for something that other people might not agree with me on, or all
Mhm.
these fears that you have when you're kids. And I just gave it all to Sal. Like I gave her all the power and all the voice and confidence that just I love her. If I could hang out with any character I've
Yeah.
ever written, it would absolutely be Sal.
Yeah, I know. I was like, dang, I don't think I'm cool enough to hang out with Sal though. Like,
Me neither, and I made her up.
I know. Yeah. All right, cool. Well, we're just about coming up on an hour, so I was wondering, just like, if anybody reads your book, what do you hope they take away from it? What was the main message you were trying to get across with this book?
Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So I guess, like this idea that I mentioned earlier about, our actions having consequences,
Hmm.
from whether it's from killing a spider or, stopping a forest fire,
Hmm.
that all of our actions have unintended consequences,
Yeah.
but most of them will never know what they are. Like a good example is this, the bird, the Bitternell thrush that's,
Hmm.
endangered because of deforestation and hurricanes in the Caribbean. Like
Yeah.
that is not an obvious, re- you know, consequence. Like we wouldn't think
Hmm.
about, but that little tiny bird is also like leaving a hole in the ecosystem in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for the forest? So there's always every action or has a consequence, and
Hmm.
we don't know what they are, and we don't know who it's going to affect or when. Just like with
Hmm.
this situation with the intervention in Central America in the 80s is
Yeah.
having consequences in New Hampshire in the present day.
Yeah.
And so it's not a matter of like immediate consequences or consequences to your community or to a community you will ever know about, but like
Yeah.
thinking about all the things we do
Mhm.
somewhere, sometime, somehow, there's going to be a consequence to every single thing we do. So I guess maybe I would leave you with that.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think that's such an important one to focus on, because I think like one thing that just continually freaks me out about climate change is that like things will happen and people will be like, "Yep, never saw that coming." Like when we were, like worried about climate change, like people always talk about, like sea level rise or forest fires or something, but nobody thinks like, oh, like the polar vortex is going to dip down into Texas and people are going to freeze to death in their homes, like it's like pretty crazy stuff that you maybe would not have thought of. And I think that's probably like a pretty hugely important lesson for people to learn, is that, and to really internalize, is that like you have no idea. Like that's why you should always be careful and respectful, because you have no idea like what kind of like horrible consequences your actions could have later down the line. And that's not like to say you should just be constantly living in a state of fear, but I
Well,
think
there's a line in the book when the kids are
uh,
little that when they're talking about killing that spider, like whether
yeah.
it is wrong to kill the spider. And
Mhm.
I'm not remembering my exact words, but Katie says something to
Mhm.
the effect of, Daniela wants to kill the spider, and Katie doesn't want to kill the
Yeah.
spider, and Katie wins. And the reason she wins is
Mhm.
she says, "I would rather
Yeah.
cause something horrible to happen because I did something good by
Mhm.
saving the spider than cause a disaster because I did something selfish." So
Yeah.
Katie is imagining a disaster could happen if she killed the spider, and Danielle is imagining a disaster could happen if they don't kill the spider.
Right.
And Katie's like, oh, basically, she's like, always come from a place of good. If you make decisions based on good and for
Mhm.
good reasons, it's you can live with it better. And that's not to say that good intentions are enough. I
Yeah.
don't mean to say that at all. That's never
Sure.
enough. Good intentions do not absolve you of your actions,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
just making choices based on good ethics
Mhm.
is the best way to move forward, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. I have that line highlighted in my copy of the book, my PDF copy. So yeah, I thought that
Good.
was fantastic. Cool. Well, I think that's probably a good place to end our discussion. Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed getting to talk to you. Your book is amazing, and I recommend people read it. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. I loved your questions too. During
Oh,
these
thanks.
conversations, a lot of times I get questions about like the relationships or the geography, and I love that we just really got to dig into the climate and
Yeah.
immigration issues. So I thank you for your questions.
Yeah, of course. That's really all we do on this podcast. So
That's awesome. Well, I
yeah,
really enjoyed it.
cool. Thank you.